M2 Max versus M2 Ultra Max Studio. Is it worth spending an extra at least $2,000, double the price to get the M2 Ultra? Well, I ran a ton of benchmarks as well as real-world tests, and right now I will give you guys all of those results to show you which one you should buy depending on what you do. Right on the beginning, let me share with you good news. Do you remember last year the M1 Ultra, right? So you might know the scaling was not exactly how it should be. In other words, the M1 Ultra was not exactly double the M1 Max. In fact, it was far from it. Well, M2 Ultra is a different beast. Spoiler alert, it's even more than 2 times faster in some workloads. The Mac Studio M2 Max starts at $1,999. The Mac Studio M2 Ultra at $3,999. Does that mean the M2 Ultra is really double the performance of the M2 Max? The M2 Ultra chip simply uses the Ultra Fusion technology to connect the die of the two M2 Max chips, doubling the performance. By the way, that's official Apple claim. But should we trust to so bold Apple's claims? Let me start with physical differences. Cheapest Mac Studio M2 Max looks absolutely the same as the most expensive M2 Ultra model. Main invisible difference on the outside are those two USB-C ports in the front. On the M2 Max, those are USB 4 ports. On the M2 Ultra, those are Thunderbolt 4 ports. So in total, Mac Studio M2 Max has 4 Thunderbolt 4 ports. The M2 Ultra has 6 Thunderbolt 4 ports. So not exactly double here, but okay, fine. The Mac Studio M2 Max weighs 5.9 pounds or 2.7 kilograms, but the M2 Ultra 7.9 pounds or 3.6 kilograms. That difference is mainly due to the massive heavy copper heatsink, which is necessary to cool down the M2 Ultra monster chip. Necessary, but not quite enough. I prepared about Mac Studio M2 Max versus Mac Studio M2 Ultra temperatures separate video, so make sure you are subscribed to this channel so you won't miss it. To M2 Max Mac Studio, you can connect simultaneously up to 5 displays. The M2 Ultra can handle 8 displays. Other than that, both have the same 10G Ethernet, Wi-Fi 6E as well as Bluetooth 5.3. The M2 Max you can spec up to 96 gigs of memory. The M2 Ultra can go up to 192 gigs of memory. But the base model M2 Max has only 32 gigs, and that gets me into SSD speeds, which are important in case you don't have enough physical memory, so your Mac will need to swap to disk. The base model Mac Studio M2 Max has 512 gig SSD, base model of M2 Ultra has double that, 1 terabyte of storage, and compared side by side, the SSD in the M2 Ultra with speeds around 5800 megabytes per second is up to 2.14 times faster than in the base M2 Max with just 2700 megabytes per second. Blackmagic disk speed test shows 1.71 times difference. So if you are thinking about saving money on memory, then get the bigger SSD at least. But it's always better to have more memory than disk space, because the memory is always much faster than any SSD. Speaking of memory, the M2 Max should have 400 gigabytes per second memory bandwidth, while the M2 Ultra 800 gigabytes per second memory bandwidth. I measured in amorphous memory mark 244 gigabytes on the M2 Max and 430 gigabytes per second on the M2 Ultra. That's 1.76 times difference. Geekbench 6's single-core score, which should be in fact identical for both machines because the M2 Ultra is using the same M2 Max chip, just has 2 of those, but it's not. The M2 Ultra score is 3.5% higher. This slight single-core boost I saw also in other tests. It's strange because both were running exactly same frequencies, 2420 MHz on the E cores, 3280 MHz on the P cores, and 1398 MHz on GPU cores. And the multi-core score was also surprising to me. The M2 Ultra score of almost 22,000 points is just 47% higher. That's a nice example why I always teach my clients not to rely on any synthetic benchmarks, because they can be very misleading. And because Geekbench 6's results are not comparable to older Geekbench 5 ones, and I know there is many people out there who want to compare their older results too, I ran that for you too. In Geekbench 5, we can see much better scaling, where the M2 Ultra scored 86% higher than the M2 Max. We can finally see almost perfect scaling in the Cinebench CPU stress test, where the Mac Studio M2 Ultra multi-core score is exactly 1.95 times higher. Great. But what about CPU performance in Blackmagic RAW test? 44 FPS for the M2 Max versus 92 for the M2 Ultra. Here we can see even 2.09 times higher performance in rendering 8K 12:1 Blackmagic RAW. And what about audio producers? I used the Logic Pro benchmark where both Mac Studios were set to internal speakers, I/O buffer size of 1024 and processing threads to the maximum available. That's 12 for the M2 Max and 24 for the M2 Ultra. The M2 Max was able to play 198 tracks before system became overloaded, while the M2 Ultra exactly 400 tracks. That's even a bit higher than 2 times more. You can download this benchmark in this video description down below and compare your system easily too. Leave me a comment down below what computer you have and how many tracks you achieved. 3D artists who rely solely on CPU rendering in apps like SideFX Houdini would for sure benefit from having the M2 Ultra. This sample Blender project, it was rendered using CPU only on the M2 Ultra 1.86 times faster. 890 seconds M2 Max versus 478 seconds M2 Ultra. Almost perfect scaling here. And again, link to downloading the same project I gave you in this video description down below. Almost everyone nowadays needs to use web browsers, so good news is the performance on both is the same. But what surprised me was the difference in performance between Safari and Google Chrome. I'm not a fan of Google Chrome at all. I use Safari for almost everything. But truth is, at least in my synthetic tests using Speedometer and Jetstream 2, the Chrome scored always a bit higher. And this is also an interesting topic. Let's talk about the GPU capabilities. The Mac Studio M1 Max, you can upgrade from 30 to 38 GPU cores. That's almost 27% increase in performance, unlike the M2 Ultra, which you can upgrade from 60 to 72 cores, and that's just 20% improvement. But today I'm comparing the base Mac Studio M2 Max with 30 GPU cores and the top model M2 Ultra with 72 GPU cores. That's 2.4 times more GPU cores, so we should expect also 2.4 times more performance, right? Let's find out. Geekbench 6 metal benchmark shows only 1.76 times higher score for the M2 Ultra. Geekbench 5 shows 1.86 times higher score. So, looks like we don't have exact 2.4 times scaling. But don't give up, I will get to it later, where I will show you much more in the video editing section. The previously shown Blender sample project, rendered on GPU cores this time, showed mind-blowing 2.2 times faster render time on the M2 Ultra. 281 seconds M2 Max versus 128 seconds M2 Ultra. That's a very nice surprise. So when I compare the CPU render times with those rendered only using GPU, it's night and day. The GPU render was on the M2 Max 3.15 times faster than CPU ones. The M2 Ultra GPU render was even 3.74 times faster. For the photo editors out there using latest Affinity Photo 2, the combined multi-CPU performance is just 1.58 times higher on the M2 Ultra. In the combined single GPU test, we see again only 1.49 times higher score on the M2 Ultra. So photo editors would be better to buy the M2 Max and save some money on more memory or storage. And to be in picture, those over 50,000 points on GPU is almost 5 times higher than on my 24-core Intel Mac Pro with 2 Vega Pro 2 graphics cards combined. And obviously much more performance than you would get out of any Adobe Photoshop. I'm sorry to all Photoshop fanboys. By the way, I'm working on ultimate video comparison of about 10 Macs from past 4 years, from M1 Air over Intel Mac Pro up to M2 Ultra. So if you wanna see those videos, make sure you subscribe to my channel and enable all notifications so you won't miss it. but the area in which any Mac Studio excels is video editing. The Mac Studio M2 Ultra has 4 media engines for hardware-accelerated encode and decode H.264, HAVC, ProRes and ProRes RAW video files compared to just 2 on the Mac Studio M2 Max. So again, we should see roughly double the performance, right? Well, not so quick. Let me show you exactly in which areas it's truth and in which it's not. If you are working with mentioned H.264, HAVC or ProRes files, any Mac Studio will be fine for you. When transcoding XFAVC 4K DCI 60fps 10-bit 422 all intra source to ProRes 422 using Apple Compressor, the M2 Ultra was only 1.4 times faster. Surprisingly, transcoding not all I intra but long GOP 4K DCI 60fps 10-bit 422 took exactly the same time on both. And we all know long GOP files are much harder to process. So big win here for the Mac Studio overall. Scaling is little better when transcoding 4K DCI ProRes 422 source to 4K DCI HAVC 10-bit 420, where the M2 Ultra was 1.72 times faster than the M2 Max. And again, surprisingly, transcoding same source file to HAVC 10-bit 422 instead of just 420 took again exactly the same time, and that's amazing. DaVinci Resolve's Candle test is very heavy project with lots of blur and noise reduction nodes. In 66 blur nodes, the M2 Ultra was able to play 26 FPS, while the M2 Max only 16 FPS. So the M2 Ultra is 1.63 times faster than the M2 Max in this test. In 6 noise reduction nodes test, the M2 Max was able to play 33 FPS, M2 Ultra 46 FPS, which is only 1.39 times faster. So that's far from double the performance for double the money, right? But let's have a look at some real life stuff. My past 3 videos were really heavy. A lot of multicam footage, source files in 8K Canon RAW, 60 FPS, some HAVC 6K and 4K files, some ProRes 4444, simply a lot of heavy stuff and mixed footage. So it's not possible to take full advantage of the media engine. Projects are in 4K, 60 FPS and HDR. Working with multicam 8K Canon RAW in 30 FPS, the M2 Ultra can play it fine without any dropped frames. But the same in 60 FPS is a problem. Plain Canon RAW 8K 60 FPS source file with no color grading at all can the M2 Max play at 24 FPS, while the M2 Ultra at 53.5 FPS. That's 2.23 times more for the Ultra, finally. So, as you can see, transcoding to proxies is necessary on both. I use proxies in source resolution, so in case of the Canon RAW files, it's in 8K. The others 6K and 4K. Transcode of all media in this project, roughly 2 terabytes of source files, took on the M2 Max 1 hour 26 minutes and 43 seconds, and just 46 minutes and 29 seconds on the M2 Ultra. That's 1.87 times difference, and those almost 45 minutes saved is very noticeable. But video editing is not just about to put some footage, cut it and go. It's also about some headlines, lower thirds, effects and so on. So smart way to get good performance is to use Smart Render Cache. And generating Smart Cache on this whole 8-minute long project from Proxy Timeline took 22 minutes and 12 seconds on the M2 Max, but just 14 minutes and 43 seconds on the M2 Ultra, which is 1.5 times less. But generating the same cache from the original source heavy files and not proxy ones took almost double the time for the M2 Max, 39 minutes and 2 seconds, but just 20 minutes and 43 seconds on the M2 Ultra, which is exactly 1.88 times faster in this case. Simply, the M2 Ultra excels when dealing with really heavy projects. Now let's have a look at actual export times. Export to 4K ProRes 422HQ took on the M2 Max 37 minutes and 13 seconds, and on the M2 Ultra 29 minutes and 36 seconds, so only 1.26 times scaling. That's disappointment, but related only to this specific project. In a moment I will show you exact opposite on different one. On my other past project with same mix of 8K RAW, 6K and 4K files to generate Smart Cache took the Mac Studio M2 Ultra 1.21 times less time. So again, not nice scaling here. But to render out that project is completely different story. On the M2 Max it took 38 minutes 22 seconds, but the M2 Ultra did it in just 17 minutes 42 seconds, and that's 2.23 times faster. And I saved the best surprise for last. One of my last projects was really crazy heavy. Again, multicam 8K Canon RAW at 60 FPS, 4K timeline 60 FPS in HDR with a lot of tracking, animated dots behind my hair, simply unnecessarily overkill. To generate proxy files took on the Mac Studio M2 Max 23 minutes 24 seconds versus just 10 minutes and 54 seconds, so the M2 Ultra is here 2.15 times faster. Mentioned tracking of my hair on the 8K RAW files took 6 minutes 34 seconds on the Max versus 2 minutes 59 seconds on the Ultra, which is 2.2 times faster. So far, absolutely excellent scaling, even better than it should be in theory. But I'm still not done yet, darling. Wait, I'll show you even better one. To render this specific project to 4K ProRes 422 HQ took 8 minutes 15 seconds on the M2 Max, but hold tight, the Mac Studio M2 Ultra rendered it in just 3 minutes 38 seconds, which is exactly 2.27 times faster. That's mind-blowing. Oh my Morgonaut lord. So, which one you should get, it all depends on what actually you plan to do. Watch again carefully all these graphs and numbers in specific areas of your interest. It can help you decide if the time saved is worth paying double the price or not. In general, the Mac Studio M2 Max is a very powerful Mac and will do well anything you will throw at it, especially if you are working in codecs supported in the media engine. The Mac Studio M2 Ultra, as the name says, is simply really ultra in many areas. 3D GPU rendering, music production, and especially video editing, those are areas where you will see the biggest gains over the M2 Max, and sometimes, as I showed you in this video, even up to 2.27 times more performance. And if you are working with RAW files like mentioned Canon RAW, the M2 Ultra Mac Studio would serve you better. And that's what I kept for myself. If you guys wanna see more comparisons and reviews, make sure you hit the circle below to subscribe. Let me know down in the comment section below which one do you think is better value for yourself. And see you in my next video. Bye bye, my Macintosh friends.